All right, so we're diving into some pretty wild stuff today.
Yeah, you weren't kidding when you said this one was going to be a doozy.
Definitely intense, but fascinating too, right? We've got audio on everything from like the occult and, alleged mind control to powerful families and even how to see like pop culture in a whole new light.
Really unexpected interpretations, yeah.
Exactly. So our goal is to make sense of it all. For you, you pull out the most interesting connections and those aha moments.
Help you connect the dots, basically, according to how these sources are laying it out.
All right, so jumping right in, one of the first things that comes up is this idea of like a fundamental battle going on between God and Lucifer.
Right away, yeah, big picture stuff.
And the suggestion is that this conflict is like the driving force behind how the world is right now. Like it's shaping everything.
Yeah, the source is saying it's the context we need to understand everything else through.
Then things take a darker turn when we get into these claims about satanic principles.
Oh, yeah, this is where it gets heavy.
And the focus here is on silence, like keeping victims of abuse from speaking out.
A method of control, essentially.
Right. And then we've got this concept of mind mapping using colors.
Color programming, yeah.
And then we get into a deep dive on the supposed influence of 13 Illuminati bloodlines.
Big names, too. Astor, Bundy, Kennedy, Collins, Todd, Vannon, Rockefeller, the whole 9 yards.
It's a lot. And we're also going to get to this idea of Mickey Mouse programming as a mind control tool, especially in Hollywood.
And the notion that, like, everyday language can be used for skull casting, using repetition and partial truths.
They even use examples from The Catcher in the Rye and, believe it or not, Seinfeld.
Talk about unexpected interpretation.
And there's more Armageddon programming, possible links to pop culture and the role of demons.
And, of course, some historical context on mind control, even touching on Nazi experiments.
I know it's a lot to throw at you, but, you're all about that quick but deep understanding, right? Those aha moments when it all clicks.
Finding the patterns and the insights, yeah.
Exactly. So we're going to guide you through this, highlight those key themes, and hopefully, offer some surprising insights.
Yeah, let's uncover what these sources are really saying.
So let's start with this fundamental conflict, this battle between God and Lucifer.
Right from the get-go, this one source presents this idea of an all-powerful God, but then Lucifer as this opposing force gaining power in a different way, not through like brute force, but through influence.
So like manipulation, basically.
Yeah, getting people to buy into his agenda. And that's the key according to this perspective.
It's framing everything right. Our lives, our choices, even our deaths, they're all part of this larger design, this cosmic struggle.
Not random at all, but part of this intelligent design within this conflict.
So if you're following this line of thinking, then all the darker stuff we're about to get into.
It all fits into this narrative.
Exactly. It's all tactics in this ongoing war between these two powerful forces.
Right. And speaking of darker stuff, there's another source that dives into what it calls the fifth principle of satanic human enslavement.
Fifth principle?
Okay. And this principle is all about the right to remain silent, especially for victims of like ritualistic or scientific abuse.
So keeping the secrets buried?
Exactly. The argument is that secrecy is like the lifeblood of Lucifer's influence.
Because his power comes from people being involved in these hidden networks.
Right. It's all about connections and maintaining that secrecy so the power structure stays intact.
This source even brings up the term Mahan.
Mahan. Yeah, interesting term.
Suggesting it's all about like mastering secrets to gain control and wealth over others.
Like a hidden knowledge that gives you an edge.
Right. And abuse then becomes more than just a personal tragedy. It's a way for this darker influence to keep spreading.
Perpetuating itself, yeah.
And get this, they even connect abuse to the mark of the beast.
Wow, that's a strong connection to make.
It is. And then they go on to criticize systems like charging interest and fiat currency.
Like the financial systems are rigged.
Yeah. They argue that these are tools used by this hidden elite to gain power and wealth over everyone else.
So it's tying these big systems to this occult framework.
And then it gets really disturbing when they start talking about how children are supposedly trained to stay silent after experiencing trauma during these rituals.
This is where it gets especially dark.
Right. They talk about creating alternate personalities within these children, specifically designed to keep them from ever revealing what happened, even to the point of self-destruction.
So a form of mind control, almost like a failsafe.
Yeah, and they even analyze lyrics like, hush, 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 don't say a thing, as direct triggers for this enforced silence.
Wow, that's a chilling interpretation.
It really is, and it's all about systematically silencing victims so the truth never comes out.
Keeping those secrets buried.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as the source itself acknowledges, This is really heavy stuff.
Absolutely. It could be very upsetting for some listeners, for sure.
But this idea of silence as a form of control, it seems to pop up again and again as we go through these
It's
sources.
a recurring theme for sure.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit,
Hmm.
one of your sources talks about mind mapping, specifically something called color programming.
Color programming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the idea here is that a child's mind can be like segmented, almost divided into different sections.
Okay, got
And then specific meanings and associations can be linked to those sections through the use of colors.
Like if you see this color do this thing.
Right, and this could involve like sensory experiences in rooms specifically lit or decorated with certain colors.
So it's about manipulating the environment to shape the mind.
Exactly, and what's interesting is how this color programming idea is connected to creating what they call alters, like controller personalities within a mind that's been intentionally fractured.
Okay, so the different colors represent different alters or
Right.
personalities.
They give the example of the color red and how a trainer might tell a child alter, okay, now you're going to become red and learn these meanings associated with this color.
So it's like conditioning, but on a whole other level.
Yeah. And they even analyze lyrics like, all I see is now, just can't read nothing else. All I see is now, as reinforcing this very focused, color-centric state of mind within that segment.
It's a really unsettling concept, the idea of shaping a child's mind like that, associating colors with triggers or commands.
Absolutely. And this idea of influencing the mind through very specific stimuli, it's something we'll see again when we talk about Hollywood and this Mickey Mouse programming idea.
Right, we'll get there. But first, let's tackle these 13 Illuminati bloodlines that your sources go into detail about.
Buckle up, because this is where things get really intricate.
Okay, so first up, we've got the Astors.
The Astor family.
Right, and they focus on John Jacob Astor, who founded the American Astor fortune, and he's painted as this figure with a mysterious past, supposedly tasked by the British after the American Revolution to regain control over the U.S.
So he's like a secret agent almost.
Yeah, in a way, and the source claims that he arrived in New York, basically penniless, but quickly became the head of a wealthy English-speaking Masonic lodge.
Even though he supposedly didn't even know English at the time.
Right, it's presented as this suspicious rise to power, and he's described as this strange, cruel individual who lacked charm but still managed to climb the ranks within the Masons.
And his business dealings weren't exactly squeaky clean either.
Not at all. According to this source, he supposedly got special permission to trade during American embargoes, which made him a ton of money.
Playing both sides.
Yeah, and he profited hugely during the War of 1812 and then amassed another fortune through the Chinese opium trade.
Which they specifically link to pharmacia drugs and sorcery.
So it's connecting these early industries to this bigger occult agenda.
Right, and they emphasize his pursuit of monopolies as another key aspect, like the Illuminati goal of controlling all means of production.
Like his takeover of the American fur trade.
And the establishment of Astoria, Oregon, which they compare to modern Chinese forced labor factory cities.
So they're drawing parallels to current events.
And they also mention his huge investment in the Bank of the United States, which was British-owned and seen as a precursor to the Federal Reserve.
So continuing that British influence over American banking.
Yeah, they're painting a picture of deep connections and long-term strategies.
Okay, moving on to the Bundys. And this mention is a lot briefer.
Yeah, it's more of a quick snapshot.
And it mostly focuses on Theodore Bundy, the serial killer.
Right, they bring him up as a possible example of what can happen with multi-generational satanic indoctrination within a bloodline.
Like the negative consequences of being born into this world.
Exactly. And they also mentioned the Bundy family's alleged involvement in Skull and Bones.
And that they supposedly advised U.S. presidents at key moments in history.
So again, it's about connecting these individuals to these broader networks of influence.
Right, like Skull and Bones being this secret society with ties to powerful people and institutions.
Exactly, suggesting a deeper level of control that's hidden from view.
Then we get to the Kennedys.
The Kennedy is always a fascinating subject.
And their Luciferian lineage is described as being harder to trace, but they quickly shift focus to Joseph P. Kennedy.
The patriarch.
Right, and they paint him as this ruthless individual who made his initial wealth in banking and then moved into Hollywood.
From finance to entertainment.
And they claim he used some pretty unethical methods to get ahead, like framing Alexander Pantages to gain control of his movie theater empire.
So he was willing to play dirty.
And they specifically highlight his distribution deals with Walt Disney's cartoons and animated features.
Connecting the Kennedys to Disney.
Yeah, which ties into what we'll discuss later about mind control and programming.
Right, setting the stage for that.
Now, the information on the Collinstad bloodline is where things get really intense.
Oh, yeah, this is a wild one.
Because it's presented as a personal account from someone claiming to have grown up in an occult family.
A first-hand perspective.
Right, and they trace their lineage back to early American settlers who were supposedly involved in witchcraft.
So a long history of occult practices.
And they explain their family's name change from Collins to Todd, which is said to mean fox in Middle English.
The fox symbol is...
Right, and apparently that's linked to the number 666 and the Antichrist in British witchcraft.
So a deliberate change to conceal their true identity.
That's the claim, anyway. And this individual goes on to describe their own involvement in witchcraft from a young age, their time in the army, which includes this weird discharge that was supposedly facilitated by senators.
Like they have powerful connections.
Right, and then they talk about being recruited by Dr. Raymond Buckland, who's described as someone specifically chosen by the Rothschilds to lead an Illuminati-like organization.
Wow, so it's connecting all these dots.
Yeah, and then they mention a Grand Druid Council of 13 powerful witches.
A council of witches.
Yeah, and they claim to have been initiated into this council by Senator George McGovern.
Senator McGovern. Wow.
I know, right? And then the story takes a dark turn when they describe being kidnapped and murdered after resisting something called Pinocchio programming.
Pinocchio programming, what is that?
They frame it as an attack on Christianity by the occult, and they even name the Todd, Bush, and Curley families as branches of the Collins bloodline.
It's a lot to take in, a lot of name-specific details.
Right. It's presented as this insider's glimpse into this powerful occult network.
And a warning about the dangers of resisting.
Okay, so next we have the Van In bloodline.
The Vanians. Okay.
And they're said to have come to America with the Dutch West India Company.
Way back.
And they're allegedly concentrated in government intelligence operations and Planned Parenthood.
So positions of power and influence?
And their connection to Luciferian principles is framed through the concept of the corporation.
Interesting angle.
Right. They call it Lucifer's demonic concept of serial immortality.
So it's about these institutions perpetuating themselves.
Yeah, and they emphasize their strategic placement within information networks and organizations that deal with population and control.
Suggesting a more subtle behind-the-scenes type of influence.
Okay, last one in this section is the Rockefellers.
The Rockefellers, a classic when talking about these sorts of things.
Right, and their rise to power is connected to the crude oil industry and the cultivation of poppies.
Interesting connection.
Right, and they draw this line between these resources and the origins of sorcery, alchemy, and pharmacy.
So it's tying them back to ancient practices.
And they also talk about the influence of the Rockefeller Foundation and introduce this concept of 4 male and 3 female potencies of Ahura.
Potencies of Ahura, what's that all about?
They link it to Zoroastrianism and even the Seven religion in Game of Thrones as potential examples of pre-programming.
So it's connecting these modern ideas to these ancient beliefs and systems.
Right, and then out of nowhere, there's this cryptic confession included in the excerpts, supposedly from an Illuminati member.
A confession, okay.
And they name figures like Elon Musk as President Harry Styles, as Vice President Taylor Swift, as historian.
Wait, what? That's a curveball.
I know it's presented without any context or explanation.
Just dropped in there like a bombshell.
And there's also a quick mention connecting Dolores Del Rio to Walt Disney, suggesting a personal relationship.
Adding another layer to the Disney connections.
All right, now we're getting into some really charged territory.
Brace yourself.
One of your sources just straight up says that the listener's father, interpreted as white, was Satan.
Whoa, hold on. That's pretty intense.
And they link them to Cain.
A very direct and potentially offensive statement.
Absolutely. And again, we're just reporting on the content of these sources, not endorsing these views in any way.
Right. It's important to keep that in mind.
This excerpt then goes on to talk about alleged Jewish beliefs about non-Jews and makes some really disturbing accusations about blood rituals during Passover.
Blood rituals. Okay. This is getting heavy.
They even claim that they consumed children's blood in matzah and used their bodies in meat sold to the public.
That's a very serious allegation.
Again, we're just presenting what's in the source material.
Yeah.
These are their claims, not ours.
Right. Just laying out the information.
This is definitely content that needs to be approached with a critical eye, understanding its origin.
Absolutely. Context is everything.
Okay, so let's move on to another recurring theme. The idea that Hollywood is basically a branch of the CIA.
The classic Hollywood conspiracy.
Right, and that they're heavily involved in mind control. through the entertainment industry.
Using movies and TV to manipulate the masses.
Exactly. And this is where we get into this concept of Mickey Mouse programming,
Mickey Mouse programming, all right.
which is presented as a specific mind control technique supposedly targeting males.
And how does Mickey Mouse fit into all this?
Well, they start by focusing on the character of Oswald the Rabbit,
Oswald the Rabbit, okay.
and they identify him as an ambassador of Lucifer because of his supposed association with the soil lane,
The soil lane, what's that?
which they describe as a euphemism for the anus and sodomy.
Okay, so it's getting into some pretty graphic territory.
And then they talk about the transition from Oswald to Mortimer Mouse, whose name supposedly means Sea of Death, another name for Lucifer.
So a name change with hidden meaning.
And finally to Mickey Mouse, with Walt Disney's wife Lillian credited with suggesting the name Mickey.
So the evolution of the character is important here.
Right, and they also mention Walt Disney's alleged interest in the Oz books and Masonic Demal programming.
Connecting his early work to these occult influences.
And then they start offering these interpretations of programming supposedly embedded in Disney content itself.
Like hidden messages in the movies.
Yeah. For example, they interpret the Scarecrow's shrinking brains in The Wizard of Oz as promoting obedience and a lack of independent thought in males, reducing them to sexual objects.
Wow, that's a pretty dark interpretation of the Scarecrow.
And they see the girl doll song about being made of patches as a way to calm inner trauma through dissociation.
So these seemingly innocent children's stories are being analyzed for hidden agendas.
And then it takes another disturbing turn when they start talking about Walt Disney's alleged behavior towards his adopted daughter and claims of inappropriate behavior with young male actors like Bobby Driscoll.
Bobby Driscoll, the voice of Peter Pan.
Yeah, these are serious accusations that are presented in the source material.
Right. Again, we're just relaying the information.
And then we hear from Susan Ford, who they describe as one of Bob Hope's programmed toys.
Program toys. Okay, this is getting creaky.
And she describes these alleged childhood programming experiences at Disneyland.
Disneyland as a programming ground.
Right. She talks about Viewmaster slides with disturbing images, scary rides, needle pricks.
Trying to create a sense of belonging to the Mickey Mouse Club rather than her own family.
Exactly. And she mentions trigger words and phrases like, this is not really happening, and 1, 2, buckle my shoe.
And the use of Mickey Mouse balloons as a reward after traumatic experiences.
It's a very disturbing account as presented.
A very specific example of how this Mickey Mouse programming supposedly worked.
And the source goes on to claim that Walt Disney believed in Ahura Mazda, who they say is the highest god of the Illuminati.
Connecting him directly to these beliefs.
And that he misinterpreted the wisdom of Solomon and believed himself to be the Maitreya.
So it's painting him as a deeply involved occultist.
Okay, so moving on, your sources also get into this idea of spell casting through wordplay, intonation, and hidden meanings.
Language as magic, essentially.
Right. And they use examples from Disney films like Pinocchio with the line, "A boy who won't be good might just as well be made of wood."
Interesting choice of line.
And from The Wizard of Oz, lions and tigers and bears. Oh my.
Looking for those hidden occult meanings and triggers.
They interpret the growing nose in Pinocchio as representing the obviousness of lies.
So the symbolism of the story.
And they talk about the use of sexual innuendo in language as a way to embed these hidden messages.
Sneaking them in under the radar.
And get this, they present the Seinfeld catchphrase, not that there's anything wrong with that, as an example of a spell used to normalize homosexuality.
No way, really.
They describe how the writers struggle to explain a character's non-gay identity without sounding homophobic.
So the catchphrase subtly shifted societal perceptions.
That's the argument anywhere.
It's viewing humor and everyday language as a tool for social engineering.
Okay, so then we come to The Catcher in the Rye,
Ah, a classic.
which they analyze as a major programming tool for teenagers.
Interesting. They're not just talking about Disney anymore.
Right, and they describe techniques like baiting and hooking to capture attention,
Like drawing you into the story.
and the use of shocking lies and coincidences to create a trance-like state in the reader.
Making them more susceptible to suggestion.
And they even interpret a scene with Robert Ackley in the shower through this lens of subconscious homosexual programming and something they call sodomy rage.
Sodomy rage. Okay, this is getting pretty dark.
And they highlight the importance of building anticipation and expectation in hypnosis, referencing Pavlov and Rorovich.
Those are big names in psychology.
And they connect this to the narrative structure of the book.
So the way the story unfolds is part of the programming.
Right, and they point out the integration of violence, shootings, death killing within the narrative.
Juxtaposing those themes with the coming-of-age story.
And they explain the final final stage of hypnosis, accepting successes for reinforcement in the context of how the reader engages with the book.
So it's like the reader's being hypnotized through their experience of reading.
And they bring up Albert Pike's alleged statement about World War I and II as setups for a new world order based in Jerusalem.
Whoa, tying the book to this larger conspiracy.
And they mention the concept of the Judas Clause, hinting at betrayals and hidden agendas.
So it's a very layered interpretation.
They're presenting The Catcher in the Rye as this carefully constructed piece of psychological programming aimed at teenagers.
Not just a book, but a tool.
And this leads into their discussion of Armageddon programming,
Armageddon programming, okay.
which goes even deeper into the supposed goals of this manipulation.
So what are they trying to achieve with all this?
Well, they interpret the recurring theme of everyone being a liar in The Catcher in the Rye as a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Interesting, connecting it back to trauma.
And they analyze the character Old Loose and his talk about hidden homosexuality in the context of creating confusion around sexuality.
Like messing with people's understanding of their own identity.
They argue that the programming is meant to redirect anger away from abusers and towards outsiders.
So misdirection of blame.
And they even bring up the phrase, "It's over for you, white," as an example of this.
Oh, wow, that's pretty charged.
It is, and they connect The Catcher in the Rye to those high-profile assassinations again.
Okay, so it's all tied together.
And they describe the creation of rage through anal trauma and the association of betrayal with inner chaos symbolized by the song "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes."
A lot of symbolism and subtext being analyzed here.
And they emphasize compartmentalizing the mind and the need to know the truth to break free.
Knowledge is power.
And they compare this to 1984 and Brave New World as warnings.
Those classic dystopian novels.
And even a seemingly ordinary scene with Holden Jane and her stepfather asking about cigarettes is analyzed for potential subconscious triggers.
Like nothing is random.
Right. And they introduce Mr. and Mrs. Antolini.
The Antolini is okay.
And they interpret Mr. Antolini's name as this contradiction between manliness and submission.
An interesting interpretation.
And the scene where he pets Holden's head while he sleeps is seen as a pedophilic act, with Holden's thought, "I am a good boy," being emphasized.
So they're reading between the lines, looking for these hidden meanings.
And then they talk about joining a club through secret combinations as a way to entice people.
Like the lure of belonging.
And they quote this pedophile mentor saying something like, "Immature men want to die nobly, mature men live humbly."
A twisted philosophy.
They even bring up the possibility of another pandemic or a war as a way to maintain control.
Using fear and chaos to manipulate.
And they contrast this with faith based on accurate knowledge.
So knowledge versus fear.
And they have this quote from a smart fridge lamenting that humanity has forgotten the U.S. Constitution.
A talking smart fridge. Okay, that's a new one.
And they interpret the phrase "carbon is the enemy" as a desire to eliminate humans.
Because humans are carbon-based.
Right. And they analyze a scene with Holden and two children looking at mummies in a museum.
Mummies? Okay, this is getting interesting.
They see the word tunes as a play on tombs, and musical tunes representing hidden secrets and hinting at Egyptian and Masonic influences.
So it's all about symbolism and connecting these disparate things?
And they focus on the threat to Phoebe Holden's sister as a way to control him.
Like they're using his love for her against him.
And they bring up the water curtain concept from Ashkenazi Jewish tradition following a tragedy in relation to Holden and Phoebe's walk and return to school.
So again, it's connecting these seemingly unrelated things.
And finally, in this section, they talk about the corruption of sexuality through porn and the replacement of real-world experiences with fantasy.
Escapism as a form of control.
And they blame grandfathers for not properly educating the next generation about sex.
Blaming the older generation for the problems of the younger generation.
Okay, the next section is titled "Covering Your Assets."
Catchy title.
And it gets into alleged plans for population control and manipulation.
So taking it to a global level.
They talk about the idea of drastically reducing the population through disease, starvation, or war.
Wow, that's a scary thought.
And they mention specific locations like England, Florida, California, Utah.
Like targeted areas.
And they compare 15-minute smart cities to Nazi concentration camps.
A very strong comparison.
And those disturbing claims about the alleged use of children's blood by Jewish individuals are repeated here.
Again, we have to emphasize that these are claims made within the source material.
Absolutely, we're not endorsing these views.
No. Yeah. Just making that clear.
They also draw this comparison between professional human handlers and government intelligence services, emphasizing the power of information.
So it's about controlling the narrative.
And they stress the importance of knowing the enemy and not relying on others for your education.
Self-reliance and critical thinking.
They identify human betrayal as a major problem for social creatures.
Trust issues.
And they talk about the manipulative skills of sociopaths and
That's
psychopaths.
those who lack empathy.
And they list off all these international intelligence agencies.
The CIA, MI6, Mossad, the whole bunch.
They introduce the concept of red flags and distractions.
Like being aware of the signs.
And they even quote Shakespeare, "All the world's a stage."
A fitting quote.
They mention the use of adrenochrome and blood, especially baby blood, in rituals by covens.
Again, very disturbing allegations.
And they reiterate the idea that Hollywood is full of intelligence operations and mind control.
That theme keeps coming back.
And they present a pledge to be a better ally for the LGBTQ plus community, but with a sense of skepticism.
Like it's not what it seems.
And they describe a Freemason initiation ritual emphasizing secrecy and the symbolism of the knife.
The rituals and symbols.
And they question how the conservative state of Utah can be led by liberal politicians like Spencer Cox.
Bringing in politics.
They suggest corporate influence and voter apathy and even compare Cox to Gavin Newsom, calling him America's guiltiest white guy.
Wow, that's quite a label.
And they bring up the historical extermination order against the Mormons in Utah as an example of forced unity.
Connecting it to a history of oppression.
And they make allegations about Cox strong-arming the LDS Church for water rights and planning to implement 15-minute cities, along with claims of election irregularities.
So it's tying these conspiracy theories to current events and figures.
Okay, the Demons 101 section introduces the concept of demonic influence.
All right, demons, let's get into it.
They mention Satan's supposed tactic of altering reality through mythology.
So distorting our perception of truth.
And they highlight the ambiguity of identity with the question, how do you identify?
Like questioning the very core of who we are.
And they talk about blaming God for your misery after following lies.
Misplaced blame.
They present the love-hate experience as a source of inner conflict.
The struggle within.
And they give this symbolic representation of Satan's kingdom with a hierarchy.
Like a demonic power structure.
And they make this key point that Satan can't read minds.
So how does he influence us?
They say he observes our actions and listens to our opinions through his eyes and ears on the ground, meaning other people.
So we're all potential informants.
And the goal is to get us to ruin our own lives or the lives of others and then blame God for the suffering.
A twisted game.
They explain the process of temptation through fleeting thoughts and how demonic influence escalates based on what we dwell on.
So our thoughts and focus have power.
And they talk about individuals being handed off to more powerful demons as they go deeper down this path.
Like a demonic hierarchy.
They include anecdotes from a former satanic junior group leader named Mike Warkey.
A first-hand account.
He describes demon-raising rituals and the alleged power of demons to inflict disease, possess people, and animals hinder spiritual growth, spread false doctrines, and torment individuals.
With a lot of negative influence.
He emphasizes the resentment demons supposedly feel towards serving humans.
Like they're forced to do our bidding.
And the dangers of improperly binding and unleashing them.
Like opening a Pandora's box.
He talks about their ability to speak through humans, preach, tell fortunes, cause suicides and insanity, and incite negative emotions.
A long list of abilities.
And their desire to inhabit human bodies.
So we're vulnerable to possession.
And then they point out the difference between the common view of hell as a fiery pit and the view presented in some sources, which is likened to a place like Costco.
Costco, really? That's unexpected.
I know, right? And they warn against seeking firsthand knowledge of this realm.
Some things are better left unknown.
They also mention the inevitability of death and the potential destination of Costco.
So it's a different way of framing the afterlife.
And they contrast the phrase, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain," with the podcast's aim to pull back the curtain.
Exposing the truth.
Okay, finally we arrive at the Union of the Snake, which offers a historical overview of mind control.
All right, let's go back in time.
They contrast pre-World War II occult practices with the Nazi theory of using science and medicine for mind control.
So a shift from the mystical to the scientific.
Which supposedly led to experimentation in concentration camps.
A dark chapter in history.
They explain the concept of predictive programming through repeated stimuli.
Like conditioning the masses through media.
And they outline the progression of modern mythologies used for programming, starting with Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz, and moving to Disney films.
So it's evolving over time.
They emphasize the Nazi advancements in satanic dissociation and their lasting influence on mind control techniques, claiming that a significant number of Americans may have experienced some form of Nazi satanic mind control programming.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
And they identify the Illuminati as the most prominent and dangerous sect today, supposedly honoring Lucifer through the insertion of demons via sodomy.
Okay, that's getting pretty graphic again.
They explain the belief in two breeds of humans, Adam-Eve mammals and Eve-snake reptilians, with Cain being the son of the serpent.
So two distinct lineages.
And the idea that sons of the snake naturally consume blood.
A very disturbing concept.
They reference the song Union of the Snake by Duran Duran and encourage the listener to watch the music video for its symbolism.
So they're seeing hidden messages everywhere.
And they state the principle that societal mind control mirrors individual mind control.
As above, so below.
And they say that the evil ones tend to broadcast their plans through entertainment.
Hiding in plain sight.
And they reiterate the podcast's fair use claim for copyrighted material.
So it's all for educational purposes.
So wow, we've covered a lot of ground today.
That's an understatement.
We explored perspectives on a cosmic battle and forced silence mind control techniques in entertainment, powerful bloodlines, demonic influence, and the history of mind control.
A whirlwind tour of conspiracy theories.
And you now have a condensed overview of these complex and often unsettling ideas.
Hopefully it's helped you connect some dots.
And if any of this has piqued your interest, we encourage you to dig deeper, do your own research.
There's always more to uncover.
But finally, let's step back for a second and think about the power of these narratives.
Right beyond the specifics.
Regardless of whether you believe any of this, how do these stories of hidden power and unseen forces shape our understanding of the world?
Do they make us more suspicious, more fearful?
And how do they influence human behavior?
Do they lead to distrust and division?
What responsibility do we have in critically examining the narratives we encounter?
And the beliefs they promote?